Speaking of whistleblowers in wrestling, there's a whistleblower. The Crispy Cruiser, Chris Cruz, the Baron of Baltimore. Something happens up there in that city, by God, he's going to have something to say about it. Got AEW fined $10,000 by the Maryland State Athletic Commission. Is this what I'm hearing and being led to understand?
This is indeed what happened. You may remember there was a pay-per-view event. I forget the name of it. They all kind of sound the same. A while back, a big wild brawl between Jon Moxley and Kenny Omega. A match that was truly atrocious. And they introduced a lot of weaponry into the match. There was blood. There was all sorts of gimmicks.
Well, and remember they still cut each other up for real, but at the same time they had fake blood on top of that, and they had the gimmicks were real, and another the netting of barbed wire was gimmick, and it was all, I don't know what the fuck.
So the match takes place, and after it ended, a lot of people had the reaction you and I had, which was, this is awful, and we picked it apart. Some people did like it. And then apparently Chris Cruz went a different route and decided to file a formal complaint, I guess, with the Maryland State Athletic Commission, saying that it violated, I guess, the rules and regulations for which they govern professional wrestling. Does that sound right?
Yeah, well, yes, yeah, because Maryland has a strict athletic commission. And sometimes that's for good and other times for bad. But in this case, it was very, very useful for I don't know why Chris was so upset otherwise than he was like everybody else that watched it. He was just offended as a wrestling fan that they would do this fucking goofy bullshit. But yes, the Maryland Commission it frowns on these things.
Well, we actually have the complaint. Well, I guess not the complaint, the actual
the ruling,
the consent order, the ruling.
Well, we should share some of this. I'm looking for this. I have this now.
Well, before you get to that, I'm just curious. Beyond the state of Maryland, have you ever encountered anything like this in the past where someone, either a fan or, someone who was once involved in the business, made a complaint about a wrestling promotion and the state actually acted on it? Did that ever happen? Well, Kentucky, I guess. Now that I think about it, you may have had those issues.
Well, yes. They find Tim Gonderman, who was the wrestling inspector for the State Athletic Commission at this was the early 2000s. The WWE had a pay-per-view in Lexington at Rupp Arena as Triple H against somebody, and right in front of Tim, who was there on the scene as the inspector from the commission, Triple H got juice and just evidently bled from asshole to appetite. And he went crazy because it's like having a cop standing there and breaking the law right in front of him. And, he didn't want to be a prick and stop the fucking pay-per-view match, but he blew his fucking top about it. And he recommended to the state capitol in Frankfurt that they not only fine them, but that they pull the WWE's promoter's license because it was so egregious. It wasn't like, well, we didn't know, or there wasn't anybody there. We thought we could get by with it or whatever. It's just they did it right in front of him when they knew they weren't supposed to. So that's why that led to, they ended up fining them $10,000. And that's why they didn't have a WWE television taping or pay-per-view in Kentucky for 14 years or whatever the stretch was until we got the fucking idiot Republican governor that thankfully we've gotten rid of now that, changed a bunch of regulations as they all do. And as part of that, they came back and did some TVs, but that happened there in promotional wars back when more states had commissions. You constantly had one side calling a stooge the other side. And there's been modern day examples of that, like, when all the independent wars, the Dennis Coralluzzo versus the world in the 90s in New Jersey, you'd have a bunch of people calling buildings or calling commissions or stooging shit and various things.
That's right.
So, that's happened a bunch, but notably with this amount of money, there was a $10,000 fine on the WWE for Kentucky. And, Oregon would have done things like that if they had more wrestling after they got that real strict commission in the 90s. But that's why Vince stayed away from there for 10 years or whatever more. And sometimes the commission, mostly back in the days when, especially the southern state commissions, where you had one company that was running every major town in the state every week, that when the Tennessee had a commission, they would obviously they would still take the money from Nick Goulas and Roy Welch or Jerry Jarrett, but they would favor them against any outlaws, or any other southern state or a state where they had an incumbent promotion. In Texas, they had they called it the Department of Licensing, I think. But you would always favor the established office against the outlaws, which sometimes you couldn't do it publicly or quite overtly, because that would get the athletic commission and the government involved in one of the antitrust lawsuits. But it was actually for the better. Once again, it's one of those things that you can't do, but it was for the better of the business, because the commissions knew. For example, the Kentucky State Athletic Commission knew that Christine Jarrett was going to run a show 52 times a year in the Louisville Gardens, and the gate was going to be at least 10 grand. What's 5% of 10 grand? 500. They're going to get $500 52 times a year just for Louisville. So are they going to go out of their way especially for some ragtag outlaw group that was trying to come in and get preferential dates or get dates in an arena or whatever the fuck? No, because that's just going to, in the long run, muddy the water, and it's going to be less tax revenue. Because the outlaws in those days never won the war. They just fucked up wrestling for a while in that particular territory. The only outlaw that I can think of that ever won a wrestling war was Jerry Jarrett taking Memphis from Goulas, and that was obviously, for reasons we've discussed on this program, seamless in some places and almost effortless in others, but it could not have been replicated anywhere else. And Jarrett, because he had been established as part of that company, wasn't even really the outlaw in that side. He was still running his own towns. So it just, anyway, yeah, these fucking commissions. But anyway, this particular complaint, this is like a 3-page thing that the Athletic Commission in Maryland issued a statement. But listen to this. Just listen and imagine that you're just somebody reading this in the newspaper, if it was excerpted, or just you're a person who doesn't know anything about wrestling and you're reading this. On November 9, 2019, during a professional wrestling match held in an event at the Royal Farms Arena, presented and promoted by the respondent, both Mr. Good and Mr. Smith, that's Moxley and Olivier, respectively, both Mr. Good and Mr. Smith introduced foreign objects into the ring, including a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, a broom with bristles wrapped in barbed wire, and a tool similar to an ice pick. Mr. Good used the baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire to strike Mr. Smith 3 times across his back and cause lacerations from which Mr. Smith bled. Mr. Smith used the broom with bristles wrapped in barbed wire to strike Mr. Good across the back of his head and his shoulder and cause lacerations from which Mr. Good bled. Mr. Smith also raked the broom across Mr. Good's back while Mr. Good was lying face down, and twice stomped on the broom after placing the broom on Mr. Good's back. The respondent that's AEW, was responsible for the acts of Mr. Smith and Mr. Good, or Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, or Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. Whoever these fucking clown show fucking, it just sounds so stupid. So then, hold on here, I'm trying to get this second page here. Where, God damn it, it won't keep coming up here. Stay there. Why can't I get it? There. Was it no, it's not even the second page that I wanted. It's the third page, God damn it. That's the third page. Where the file?
Page 2, number 5.
Page 2, number 5. That's yeah. Thank you for jumping in there. Page 2, number 5. Okay. The commission acknowledges that while AEW took precautions to reduce the potential for injury to both Mr. Good and Mr. Smith by using materials in certain instances to simulate injury and merely give the appearance of bleeding, Blood was introduced into the ring in other instances during this professional wrestling match through the deliberate and repeated actions of the two referenced wrestlers as scripted by AEW. So because they couldn't just go out there and have a fucking match like two goddamn professionals would and have wild and crazy and fucking ringside and stuff, they have to do the barbed wire and the stupid shit. And there's a way, which we'll talk about in a second, they could have got around a little bit of blood without all of the fucking unsavoriness and the ice picks, because they have to do that and go out there. And as we mentioned, it was ridiculous. The point to which they went in this match was just stupid. The barbed wire broom for Olivier to clean up with. They do this. It comes to the attention of the Athletic Commission, a government body, which has to fucking blister a wrestling promotion for being fucking stupid and doing stupid shit. And in the paperwork that they mentioned, they said not only do they call it real and phony at the same time, it's phony, and they did part of the damage they did to each other was real, even though it was supposed to be a phony match. But nobody believed that the match was real because all the fans in the arena knew it was supposed to be phony because it was phony. But they did real damage to each other while they were being phony. So does a document like this do any good for the public image of professional wrestling, which is now apparently both real and phony for an audience of people who know it's all phony?
Well, Chris Cruz posted something. I think it looks like from what I'm seeing here, this was from his Facebook page. Let me read this to you real quick. Look. The easy thing to say in response to the $10,000 fine levied at AEW by the Maryland State Athletic Commission is that it is pocket change for a billionaire. I get that. But it ain't nothing. And it is public, or will be on May 20th when the commission meets and then posts a consent order on its website and distributes it to all other commissions throughout the country. And keep in mind that the next violation will result in a revocation of their license in Maryland and possible show stoppage. In the middle of a match. Yeah, that's just a sentence there. I don't know if that was part of the previous one or the next one. The commission is on notice now that others are watching its actions. This puts AEW on notice as well, and it embarrasses the company. By the time tomorrow, this story will have spread far and wide. By this time tomorrow, the story will have spread far and wide, and it will appear in mainstream publications. This is a black eye for AEW and for the business.
I agree. Because it's stupid to do that shit. And, we've talked about stories before when Jerry Lawler and Terry Funk at the Louisville Gardens were having the big double juice fucking pull apart with 16 guys trying to separate them in chaos, and the commissioner coming down with his tie up all around his neck. Stop it, the match is over. And Lawler's, well, if you think it's over, you get your ass in here and try to stop it, right? That was, fortunately, it was a one-man fucking operation, the State Athletic Commission back in those days, and Christine Jarrett calmed him down by giving him the grip and saying, hey, we'll promote the wrestling and you collect the taxes. But when they, especially in the modern era, these commissions don't want to be fucked with publicly. And they could have done a street fight around the ring with fucking garbage can lids and all of their little toys and everything and gotten away with it. And they could have possibly negotiated with the commission for something with blood in it, especially if they'd agreed to go to the finish right afterwards. But instead, they just do shit that they know that they're not supposed to do, which is bleed in Maryland as well. And they had real blood because they couldn't refrain from using stupid fucking gimmicks that won't work with you and that they didn't know how to use to begin with. And then they were going to try to cover it with they had the fake blood for the commission, but they really bled also. And it was just so distasteful and stupid when you get to, and unbelievable and silly when you get to barbed wire baseball bats and barbed wire netting and fucking all these glass panes and all the fucking props and shit. It was ridiculous. And then didn't they fucking end it with a fucking suplex off the goddamn space shuttle or something? that's when you get attention, and it's distasteful to people. That's why I tried to make sure that we cut down all that goddamn Kevin Steen, El Generico, ladder, Home Depot building fucking structures in the middle of the ring so you can take bumps through tables and chairs. Fiasco shit in Ring of Honor. It would have never been sold to Sinclair Broadcasting. Because state athletic commissions don't like that shit, and neither do major broadcasting companies. Except, unfortunately, TNT has gotten in bed with apparently a goddamn old ECW mark that is trying to promote this shit, literally promote it in his company. The thing with Flair and Luger in Maryland at the Great American Bash 88, they tried to make a finish around the Maryland Athletic Commission law, which was still a law at that point, or was already a law at that point. No blood. So what they did was they had Luger about to have Flair beat. He would have him in the torture rack. Flair would be moments from submitting, but Luger would have gotten juice, and the referee would stop it on account of the commission demanded the blood be stopped, or because the match be stopped because of the blood. The problem was Luger had seldom, if ever, bladed before and was scared of it and got what we used to call a pap smear in the business. And there was barely a fucking trickle, and you couldn't even see it in the back row. And you couldn't see it in fucking ringside, much less the back row of the bleachers. So when they stopped it, the people fucking hated it. They didn't get it, and it put heat on the commission, and et cetera, et cetera. It was just, they wanted some heat on the commission instead of the promotion. Crockett and Dusty and everybody did, because, better to have heat on them than us, but it got heat on everybody because it just didn't work because there was no blood or not enough blood. But I don't know why Chris is so fucking mad at them in general, but I love it when he gets cranky. That's one guy. I've never had a crossword with Chris Cruz. We've worked together before in the past and talked to each other, and you would think two of the crankier individuals in wrestling would have been cranky with each other. I did commentary with him down in Dyersburg, Tennessee at the Herb Welch WrestlePlex about 4 years ago for an NWA show for a video they were doing. And it was so fucking inordinately hot that day, both inside and outside, that we were both wearing suits. And I think I ended up as skinny as he was by the time when we started. By the time we were finished, I sweated so bad. But I've never had any issues with the crispy one.
It is a little weird, though. I mean, just the whole, if this happens again, their license will be revoked and other states will be notified. Like, it does seem, people accuse you of having an agenda against AEW.
Sounds like somebody crapped in Crispy's Post Toasties, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's one thing to watch that and then talk about it and dismantle it and rip it apart because it deserves to be. It's another thing to go and trying to cost AEW money. I don't know. It's rather curious.
But you know what? If it's not somebody in the wrestling business, it's going to be somebody outside the wrestling business. But that's the thing. When you do stupid shit like that, people are going to notice. And there's no reason for it, which we'll get into later on.
Hey, Bash 89, Flair Funk. That night ends with Flair covered in blood, as well as Muda's mist. And a brawl all around the arena. Did the commission have anything to say about that?
Come to think of it.
Right?
I don't know whether they did or not. It may have had a new commissioner.
Flair was red and green from the mist and the blood.
Cruz was there that night.
I don't know. I don't know if he started with WCW already by that point. He may have started after that.
I don't know. But it's another one of those things that makes you go, I don't know. Rick probably just went into business for himself. He needed to bleed, let's face it. And probably at that point, they thought, well, fuck, they sold out this show, and it's the only fucking sellout we've had for a fucking year, so maybe we better not fuck with them.
And Pennsylvania was J.J. Binns, correct?
Yes. Oh, at the Bash 86, when Wahoo's blade, the tip of his blade broke off in his fucking head, and he went back in the fucking bathroom in the locker rooms and squeezed his head like he was squeezing a zit, and the blade popped out and hit the fucking mirror. And JJ Binns was like, he was going to stop the show because there was so much blood, but they said, you can't do this. This is a fucking veteran stadium. Look at all those people out there. They'll fucking riot. There better not be any more blood. And then there wasn't. But it killed the show. People wanted to see. That's why that Philadelphia and Baltimore actually were swaying toward the Crockett side, if not dead. Well, we took Baltimore from Vince, and they went to the Capitol Center in Landover. And Philadelphia was neck and neck, and sometimes the only reason why they would outdo us because they had the bigger building. Because it had been so long since they hadn't ever seen NWA-style bloody real wrestling up there, but they had seen bloody wrestling back in the old 60s and 70s days, but they had never seen wild-ass Southern shit, and that's why we were taking the towns away. Because people were buying this shit, and they wanted to see the blood and the violence and the cowboy boots and the mayhem, especially opposite ice cream bars. So it was neck and neck at that. But there was a lot of blood at the Bash, I will say that. But Philadelphia liked to see blood. They did love their blood.
So, in like the Smoky Mountain days, did you ever have to deal with the Tennessee State Athletic Commission? Like, I'm thinking of the Jericho incident at the Night of Legends, where I've never seen anyone bleed that much live.
No, Tennessee didn't have a commission by that point.
Oh, okay.
The Tennessee commission was, they may still do something with boxing, but you still pay a tax to the state. But as far as an active commission, that was abolished in Tennessee years ago. We had to work with Kentucky as the athletic commission for our Kentucky towns, but they never sent anybody because, they didn't have that many inspectors to begin with. And secondly, they knew what the fuck we were doing. And anytime we never got juice, there wasn't even there wasn't a rule against juice in Kentucky at that point in time because Ian Rotten hadn't done these garbage shows up here and gotten heat on wrestling by that point. So we could get juice or do whatever we wanted as long as everybody was licensed and we sent the fucking check in. Otherwise than that, there was no way. And Virginia, but that was the same thing. Those small towns in Virginia, we weren't running Richmond. Nobody ever came from the commission. We submitted a report with the fucking attendance, the gate, and the fucking tax check. And everybody was licensed.
With this AEW story, I don't know who's on the Maryland State Athletic Commission. I'm picturing a bunch of old guys. It may not be that. Yeah. Can you imagine someone puts the video in? Right. Someone puts the video in and there's Omega and Moxley laying in the web of barbed wire.
Oh, yeah. Well, because they remember. Think about this. Baltimore is where Billy Graham beat Bruno Sammartino for the belt in, 78?
That's right.
And Graham was covered in blood. They remember that kind of bloody wrestling. They
77.
Don't remember 77, sorry. But, all right, he got even with me for what I fucking stumped Ed Miller. Anyway, Graham was covered in blood, but there wasn't baseball bats and barbed wire and broken glass and just stupid, outlandish shit, so they would have to be out of their minds. Oh, yeah. But most people would be, because who wants to see that shit? It's fucking stupid. It's not only, it's the fans that have grown up and seen this fucking, the ECW bullshit and the fucking modern hardcore indie bullshit, but it's also the boys that grew up watching that ECW horse shit and being impressed by that as something that should be emulated instead of, do they still have grunge music? If we don't have to have grunge music anymore, why do we still have to have ECW hardcore style bullshit?
You brought up a good point there. Do you think the Maryland State Athletic Commission should have stepped in and reversed the title change because Billy Graham's feet were on the ropes?
Well, that was, that went back to the old days of, do you really reverse the referee's call or use the instant replay? They were talking about it in basketball, baseball, everything. It was really a whole controversy at the time. Yeah, the guy can bleed practically out, but his feet were on the ropes. Fuck it, that's too much. But anyway, thank you, Crispy Cruiser, for standing up for the integrity of wrestling in Baltimore, regardless of how fucking pissy you may be when you do it.